horse stumbled, catching itself on the slick, frozen scree. Mercy Beckett murmured to it, a sound lost in the wind that raked the high ridges of the Wyoming Territory. It was a thin, cruel wind, carrying the first bite of a snow that was not just coming, but already here, tasting of iron and ice. Dusk was settling, not in the gentle way of the valleys, but like a heavy, bruised purple cloak being thrown over the mountains. Mercy was cold. The cold was so deep it had stopped being a feeling and had become her entire state of being. Her fingers, locked around the reins, were numb. Her stomach was a hard, aching knot of hunger. Desperation was a taste in her mouth, metallic and sour. This was the third homestead she had tried. The first, a sod-roofed dugout lower in the valley, had been shuttered tight, a face peering through the window before a hand waved her away. The second, the larger Gable Ranch, had been worse. Mrs. Gable herself had come to the door, her face a mask of pinched piety. She had looked at Mercy, at her worn dress and the exhaustion lining her face, and seen something she did not want near her home. She had been turned away with a sharp word about drifters. This place was her last chance. The Hayes Ranch. It was marked on no map, spoken of only as a place to avoid. High up in the hills where the timber thinned and the rock began, it was said the man who ran it was hard, cut off from the world by choice. Mercy understood. She, too, wanted to be cut off, but she needed shelter first. She saw the smoke before the cabin, a thin gray ribbon torn apart by the wind. The ranch was a collection of stark, dark buildings huddled against the granite slope. A main cabin, a long barn, and a few sheds. They looked less built and more like they had grown from the rock, angular and unforgiving. Her horse, a worn-out bay, barely made it to the hitching post. Mercy's legs buckled when she dismounted. She held onto the post for a long moment, breathing in the frozen air, trying to gather the last of her strength. She had to make this work. There was nowhere else to go. She forced her legs to move. Crossing the hard-packed dirt of the yard to the cabin's porch, she raised a fist, the knuckles raw and split, and knocked. The silence that followed was heavy. Then, the scrape of a boot, the lift of a latch, and the door opened. The man who stood there matched the ranch. He was tall, lean, and looked as if he had been carved from the same hard rock as the mountains. His face was all angles, browned by the sun and wind, save for a pale scar that cut through one eyebrow. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and empty. He wore a heavy wool coat, unbuttoned. Showing the man beneath was all whipcord and muscle. He just looked at her. He did not speak. Mercy's voice came out a dry rasp. "I'm looking for work. I can cook. I can clean. I'm a hard worker." His eyes traveled over her, taking in the cheap, thin coat, the way she shivered, the desperation she could not hide. His gaze was not kind. It was assessing. Like a man looking over livestock he had no intention of buying. "We ain't hiring," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel. "Please," Mercy whispered. The word cost her what little pride she had left. "Just for a few days. The storm. I won't be any trouble. I can cook." He stared past her, up at the darkening sky where the clouds were churning. He seemed to be weighing the trouble of her presence against the trouble of finding a body in his yard come morning. "I need a cook," he finally admitted, his voice grudging. "But just for a few days. The snow's coming. When it clears, you go." Mercy nodded, a wave of dizziness passing over her. "Yes, thank you." "Don't thank me," he snapped. "I'll hire a better cook than you when the peddler comes through. This is temporary." He stepped back, holding the door open just wide enough for her to slip past him. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical blow. It was a single large room, thick with the smell of wood smoke, old sweat, and cured meat. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall. He pointed to a small, rickety cot in the darkest corner, piled with a few threadbare blankets. "That's yours. Don't touch anything else." He turned back to the fire, dismissing her. Mercy sagged against the rough-hewn wall, her body trembling with the sudden change in temperature, her eyes closing. She was safe. For a few days. There were two other people in the room, shadows that resolved into men. One was old, grizzled, with tobacco stains in his beard and eyes that had seen too much. He sat at the table, sharpening a knife, and only grunted at her presence. The other was a boy, maybe 10 or so, small for his age, with wide, skittish eyes. He was huddled near the fire, mending a bridle, and he watched her as if she were a wolf that had wandered in from the cold. "This is Wirt," Callan Hayes said, gesturing to the old man. "This is Jonah." He did not say what they were. He did not need to. Wirt was the ranch hand, the muscle. Jonah was the stable boy, the orphan. "She'll be cooking," Callan added, to them more than to her. "For a few days." Wirt just spat a stream of tobacco juice into a can. Jonah ducked his head, his focus returning to the leather strap in his hands. Mercy took a shaky breath. "My name is Mercy Beckett." Callan looked at her, a flicker of something, mockery, perhaps, in his cold eyes. "Mercy, that's a fine name for a place like this." He turned away. "There's flour in the bin, beans in the sack. Cook." Mercy did not wait. She slipped off her frozen coat, hung it on a peg by the door, and went to the dry sink to wash her hands. The water in the bucket was ice cold, but the shock of it cleared her head. She worked. It was the only answer she had. It was the only thing that kept the shaking at bay. The kitchen supplies were meager: salt pork, beans, flour, cornmeal, molasses, and coffee that smelled more like chicory and burnt barley. But it was more than she'd had in days. She moved with a quiet competence that was automatic. She stirred the embers in the hearth, added wood, and set the heavy iron kettle to boil. She sliced the salt pork and set it to frying, the smell filling the cabin, sharp and savory. She mixed cornmeal and water for Johnny cakes. She worked without wasted motion. Wirt watched her for a time, his knife scraping rhythmically. Jonah kept glancing up from his work, his curiosity warring with his shyness. Callan Hayes stood by the single window, staring out at the snow that was now falling in thick, horizontal sheets, his back a rigid wall. When the food was ready, she served it on tin plates, hot coffee, thick with molasses, fried pork, and a stack of Johnny cakes. It was plain, heavy food, but it was hot. Wirt ate, his gruff demeanor unchanged, but he cleaned his plate and wiped it with a piece of cornbread. Jonah ate so fast he seemed to inhale the food, his eyes bright. Callan ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on the table. He said nothing. When he was finished, he pushed his plate back, stood up, and pulled on his heavy coat. "Wirt, check the horses. Jonah, the wood, now." The two scrambled to obey. Callan grabbed his rifle from the wall pegs and faced Mercy. "You sleep. You start breakfast before dawn, and stay out of the way." He left, the door slamming shut, leaving Mercy alone in the sudden, heavy silence of the cabin. She sank onto her cot, pulling the thin blankets over her. She did not undress. She was too cold, too tired, and too afraid. But for the first time in a week, she slept. She proved her worth in the days that followed. She rose in the pitch black of 4 in the morning, her breath fogging in the cabin's cold. She built the fire, put the coffee on, and had biscuits rising by the time the men stumbled in from the barn. She scrubbed the cabin's floor, which had not been truly clean in years. She mended Wirt's shirt, her stitches small and even. She boiled the men's laundry in a great black kettle over the fire, the cabin filling with steam. She was quiet. She kept her eyes down. She learned the rhythms of the remote ranch, the pre-dawn chores, The long, brutal days Callan and Wirt spent in the high pastures checking on the cattle. The quiet evenings where the only sounds were the wind and the crackle of the fire. They tried to question her, in their own ways. Wirt was blunt. "Where you from, girl?" he asked one afternoon, cleaning his rifle at the table. "East," Mercy replied, her hands busy kneading dough. "East is a big place. You got family?" "No." Jonah was more delicate. He would linger near the hearth while she cooked, pretending to warm his hands. "You seen a town, ma'am? A real one?" "A few," she said, her voice soft. She found she did not mind the boy's presence. "I ain't never seen one," he said, his voice wistful. "Just the trading post." Callan was the most direct. He cornered her one evening as she was banking the fire. He stood too close, not touching her, but blocking her path. "Who you running from?" Mercy's heart leaped into her throat, but she kept her expression calm. She looked at the floor. "Just looking for work. Mr. Hayes, like I said. People don't come up here just looking for work. Not in winter. Not a woman alone." She finally met his gaze. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and deeply suspicious. "I had nowhere else to go." He held her gaze for a long, heavy moment, then stepped aside. "See that you earn your keep." He did not ask again, but she felt his eyes on her. Always. She kept her past locked away, but it visited her in flashes, sharp as a knife. The trigger was sometimes small. The sight of Callan's pistol, gleaming dark and oiled, hanging on its peg by the door. The way Wirt's eyes sometimes lingered on her. The memory would slam into her, stealing her breath. It had been in Colorado, a town called Purgatory Bend. She hadn't been a saloon girl. Not one of those girls. She worked in the kitchen. She washed pots, scrubbed floors, and cooked for the miners. It was hot, greasy, thankless work, but it was honest. Then the sheriff's son, Thomas, had noticed her. He was a fleshy, arrogant man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth. He started coming into the kitchen, leaning against the counters, whispering things that made her skin crawl. She had tried to ignore him. She had tried to avoid him. But one night, late, when the kitchen was empty, he had cornered her by the root cellar. He smelled of cheap whiskey and his own sweat. He had grabbed her, his fingers bruising her arms, pushing her against the rough plank wall. "You been playing shy long enough," he'd hissed, his breath hot on her face. "You work in a saloon. You know what you're here for." She had fought. She had told him no. He had laughed and ripped the bodice of her dress. Terror, cold and absolute, had seized her. She wasn't Mercy. She was just a thing he was going to break. Her hand, fumbling behind her, had found the knife she used for paring vegetables, a small, simple tool. She hadn't thought. She had just reacted. She had shoved it forward, hard, into his soft belly. The shock on his face, the sudden grunt. He had looked down at the wooden handle sticking out of his shirt, then at her, his pale eyes wide with disbelief. He had let her go and slumped to the floor. She had not waited. She had run. She had grabbed her small satchel, her few coins, and fled to the livery. She had stolen a horse. She had heard the shouts behind her before she even cleared the town limits. "He's been stabbed! The kitchen girl! She killed him!" She had been riding ever since. Riding north. Riding into the wild. She was a murderer. It did not matter that he had attacked her. He was the sheriff's son. She was a lone woman with no name and no family. There was no justice for her. Only a rope. She would push the memory down, her knuckles white as she scrubbed the floor, her heart hammering. She was being hunted, and this cold, remote ranch was the only place she could hide. Callan Hayes remained a mystery. He was distant, terse, and wrapped in a silence that was as cold as the wind. He spoke only to give orders, but he watched her. She felt his gaze when she bent to the fire. When she hung the laundry on the line she had strung across the cabin, the stiff, frozen clothes snapping in the wind, it was not a leering gaze. like the sheriff's son. It was something else. It was guarded, assessing. He was watching for a weakness, a lie. It made her nervous, but it also made her watchful. She watched him, too. One afternoon, the wind died down, and the sun was a weak, pale disk in the sky. The temperature rose just enough to melt the ice in the water pump. Callan took the opportunity. He was in the yard, stripped to the waist, steam rising from his skin in the freezing air. He worked the pump handle, splashing the icy water over his head and chest. Mercy was at the window, checking the sky for more snow. She froze. His back and chest were a roadmap of old pain. She saw the pale, puckered marks of bullets, but she also saw long, raised scars across his ribs and back, lines that were too straight, too parallel. They were not scars from war. They were scars from a whip. She stared, her hand pressed to her mouth. Who had done that to him? Who could hurt a man that strong and leave him so marked? He seemed to feel her eyes on him. He turned, his chest heaving, water dripping from his dark hair. He saw her at the window. His face, already hard, became granite. He did not cover himself. He just stared back at her, his eyes daring her to speak, to pity him. Mercy flushed and pulled back from the window, her heart pounding. She had seen his strength. Now she had seen his damage. It was a secret she did not want, a vulnerability in him that terrified her more than his anger. Then the blizzard set in for good. It had been threatening for days, but now it arrived. The world outside the cabin disappeared. It was not snow, but a solid, driving wall of white. The wind did not howl. It screamed, a high, thin sound that seemed to come from inside her own skull. For 3 days, no one left the cabin except to fight their way to the barn to feed the livestock. They were trapped, 4 people in one small, smoky room. The tension grew thick enough to cut. Wirt became surly, chewing his tobacco with a furious, restless energy. Jonah grew quieter, retreating into himself, carving small figures from scraps of wood by the fire. Callan became a caged animal. He paced the length of the cabin, from the door to the hearth, back and forth. For hours. He would stop, stare into the fire, his hands clenched, then start pacing again. He said nothing to Mercy about leaving. The snow had made the decision for him. Her few days had turned into an indefinite stay. He did not acknowledge it. He did not complain about the extra mouth to feed. He simply ignored her, his silence a heavier burden than any angry word. Mercy kept to her corner, to her work. She cooked, she mended, she listened to the wind, and she prayed for it to stop. Not so she could leave. She was terrified of leaving, but so the suffocating tension in the cabin would break. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, it happened. Mercy was a light sleeper. The hunt had made her so. Every snapped twig, every creak of a floorboard, brought her wide awake. This time it was a sound from outside, a raw, guttural cry, ripped from a man's throat. She sat bolt upright on her cot. Wirt was snoring by the fire. Jonah was a small lump under his blankets. The sound had come from the barn. Callan. He often slept in the barn. Mercy suspected he preferred the company of his horses to people. The sound came again, choked off. It was not a sound of anger. It was terror. She did not think. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her thin coat, and slipped out the cabin door. The wind and snow hit her instantly, trying to force her back. She bent her head and pushed through the white chaos, following the lifeline rope that stretched from the cabin to the barn. She found the barn door, her numb fingers fumbling with the latch, and slid inside. The barn was dark, filled with the warm, musty smell of animals and hay. A single lantern, turned down low, cast huge, flickering shadows. He was in the empty stall he used, thrashing in a pile of hay, fighting something that was not there. He was caught in a night terror, his eyes wide open but seeing nothing. "No!" he growled, his voice thick with sleep and horror. "No, don't leave him!" Mercy moved toward him slowly. "Mr. Hayes? Callan." He did not hear her. He was fighting, twisting, his hands grabbing at the empty air. She reached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Callan, wake up. You're dreaming." His reaction was faster than a snake. He exploded from the hay, grabbing her wrist in a grip of iron. He was half risen, his face inches from hers, but his eyes were still blind, looking through her, seeing the past. "Abel," he shouted, the name a raw wound. "Abel, hold on! God, no! Abel!" He was weeping. Tears streamed down his face, but his expression was one of fury and terrible, bottomless grief. The sight of it struck Mercy dumb. He blinked. The madness in his eyes cleared. He saw her. He saw the woman from the cabin, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Shame washed over his features, instantly followed by a cold, protective rage. He shoved her, hard. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice a low rasp. He scrambled back, away from her, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Get out of here, now!" Mercy stumbled backward, catching herself on the stall door. She did not say a word. She turned and fled. She ran from the barn, back into the screaming wind, her feet finding the rope. She burst back into the cabin, slamming the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Wirt snorted and turned over in his sleep. Mercy sank onto her cot, her whole body shaking. Her wrist throbbed where he had grabbed it. He was a strong man, a violent man. He could have broken her arm. But as she sat there in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she knew it was not just fear that made her tremble. She had seen the man behind the granite mask. She had seen the raw terror in his eyes. It was the same terror she had felt in the saloon kitchen in Colorado, the terror of being helpless. He had a ghost, a man named Abel. She had hunters. She pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, her mind racing. She was trapped in this cabin by a blizzard, with a man who was haunted by demons as savage as her own. And for the first time, in that cold, dark room, she felt something deeper than fear. She felt a strange, unwelcome, and dangerous pull toward the man who had just pushed her away. The snow did not stop. It fell for another 4 days, a silent, relentless burying of the world. The mountains disappeared. The yard became a smooth, undulating white desert. The peaks of the fence posts barely visible. The path to the barn was a deep trench, kept open only by the constant, grim work of Callan and Wirt, their shovels scraping in the frozen dawn. The ranch shrank until it was only the cabin and the barn, 2 small islands of warmth and life in a sea of white. The world outside ceased to exist. There were no hunters. There was no Purgatory Bend. There was only the wind, the lowing of the cattle in the barn, and the 4 of them, trapped in the smoky confines of the cabin. It was a cocoon, as Mercy had first thought. But the safety it offered was suffocating. The air grew thick with unspoken things. Wirt's tobacco chewing became more aggressive. Jonah, having carved his way through a small pile of kindling, took to just staring at the flames, his small face old. And Callan was the center of the storm. After the night in the barn, he had retreated so far into himself he was barely there. He spoke only in monosyllables. Wood. Water. Done. He did not look at Mercy when he ate the food she prepared. He kept his eyes on his plate, his jaw working with a tight, controlled anger. Mercy felt the change. The cabin, which had been a refuge, now felt like a cell. She was his prisoner, a prisoner of the storm, a prisoner of his dark moods. She kept to her cot, to her cooking, mending Wirt's socks until the wool was more darn than sock. Her stitches tiny and perfect, a small act of control in a world that had none. The silence between them finally broke over something as simple as a shovel. Callan and Wirt had come in, caked in snow, their beards frosted white. Wirt was cursing, complaining that the handle on the smaller shovel had split. "Need to wrap it," Wirt grumbled, holding it up. "Won't hold," Callan said, his voice rough from disuse. He was already pulling his coat back on. "I'll brace it in the smithy." "The smithy's half buried," Wirt argued, "and it's near dark." "It'll be dark tomorrow, too," Callan said. He turned to go. "Wait," Mercy said, her voice small. They both looked at her, surprised. She felt her face heat, but she pushed on. "My father used to fix handles with wet rawhide. If you have a strip, you wrap it tight while it's wet. When it freezes, it'll hold stronger than iron." Wirt stroked his beard. "Well, that's a fact." Callan just stared at her. His gaze was sharp, probing. He was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time since the barn. "You know about fixing tools?" "I grew up on a farm, before," she said, letting the word hang. He gave a single, curt nod. "Wirt, get the rawhide from the shed." He did not thank her, but the next day, he spoke to her. She was kneading biscuit dough, her back to him. "You're from Kansas, then?" He said. It was not a question. She stopped, her hands buried in the flour. "No, not from Kansas. I've passed through." He was standing by the door, pulling on his gloves. "I fought in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, they called it, before the real war started." Mercy turned. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the white square of the window. "It was just boys," he said, his voice flat. "Boys killing boys over lines on a map. I had 2 brothers. They both went. Neither came back." She thought of the name he had cried out. "Abel," she whispered. His head snapped toward her. His eyes were not cold now. They were blazing. For a second, she thought he might strike her. "Don't you say his name," he hissed. "I'm sorry," she said, recoiling. "I didn't mean—" "You don't mean anything." He cut her off. He stared at her, the muscle in his jaw jumping. "They talk about God's mercy. They talk about divine grace." He spat the word. "There's no mercy. There's just what you can take, and what gets taken from you." He left, slamming the door. Mercy leaned against the table, her hands trembling, coated in flour. He had lost 2 brothers, and he didn't believe in God, and he didn't believe in her. The incident cracked the ice, but the water beneath was turbulent. The suffocating silence was replaced by a tense, brittle awareness. He would speak to her now, mostly commands, but sometimes a gruff observation about the cattle or the wind, and he watched her. As the days blurred, a strange, fragile peace settled on Mercy. The blizzard had cut her off from the world. No one could find her here. She was safe. She began to let her shoulders drop. Just a little. One afternoon, while she was rolling out dough for a pie, using dried apples she'd found in the pantry, she started to hum. She did not realize she was doing it. It was an old tune, one without words, something she remembered from a long, long time ago, a simple rising and falling melody. She felt the air change. She looked up. Callan was standing in the doorway from the barn, his coat dusted with snow. He wasn't pacing. He was just standing there, listening. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes fixed on her. She stopped, her hands freezing on the rolling pin. The silence rushed back in. His gaze was heavy. It dropped from her face, down her neck, to the front of her dress, where flour dusted her apron. It lingered on her hands, then moved to her hips, to the way she stood. It was not the cold, assessing gaze of before. It was the look of a man who had been alone for a very long time. It was hungry, and it was confused. Mercy felt a flush creep up her neck, hot and prickly. She turned back to her dough, her heart thumping a heavy, slow beat. He did not move. He just stood there, watching her, for a full minute. Then, without a word, he turned and was gone. But his presence lingered. She felt it on her skin, a phantom touch, and she knew, with a sudden, sinking certainty, that the safety of the snow was a different kind of trap. Jonah was the one who brought the outside world crashing back in. He had been quiet since Callan's outburst about Mercy, sensing the dangerous shift in the cabin's air, but his boy's curiosity finally won out. He found her alone. Wirt was in the barn, and Callan was checking traps on the ridge. Mercy was mending one of her own stockings, her face bent to the small, careful work. "Miss Mercy?" Jonah's voice was hesitant. "Yes, Jonah?" He came closer, twisting a piece of leather in his hands. "I seen you before you came here." Mercy's needle stopped. "What do you mean?" "When I was in town, at the trading post with Wirt, about 2 weeks ago, you rode through." He looked down at his boots. "You asked Mr. Gable for work. I seen him turn you away." Mercy's stomach tightened. She remembered the trading post. She had been desperate, buying a small sack of flour, feeling the eyes of the men in the store on her back. "They was talking about you," Jonah said, his voice barely a whisper, "after you left." "What did they say, Jonah?" she asked, her voice quiet. He looked up, his eyes wide and troubled. "They said, one of the men, he'd come up from Colorado. He said you was a bad lady. He said you was wanted." He took a breath, the words rushing out. "He said you killed a man." Mercy's blood ran cold. She stared at the boy. He had come from Colorado, a bounty hunter. He had been here, in this territory, asking about her. "Miss Mercy?" Jonah's face was full of fear and a terrible, pressing need to know. Are you a bad lady?" She looked at his innocent, worried face. He who had no mother. He who was adrift in this hard place. Just as she was. How could she answer him? If she said no, it was a lie. She had taken a life. The man's face, pale and shocked, flashed in her mind. If she said yes, what would this boy see when he looked at her? What would Callan do? "Sometimes, Jonah," she finally said, her voice thick. "People are forced to do things they never thought they could, things that look bad to the rest of the world." It was not an answer, and they both knew it. Jonah's face fell. He saw the truth in her evasion. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, as if seeing her for the first time. He turned and ran from the cabin, leaving the door open to the cold. Mercy put her head in her hands, her whole body shaking. He knew it was only a matter of time. That night, the cabin was a place of torment. Jonah avoided her, his gaze sliding away if she looked at him. Wirt seemed to sense the change, his usual grumbling silenced. Callan was a thundercloud, his dark presence filling the room. He knew something was wrong. He kept looking from Mercy to the boy, his eyes narrowed. After the meager supper, Wirt and Jonah retreated to their bunks, turning their faces to the wall. Mercy sat on her cot, her back straight, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. Callan sat at the table, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth. The only sounds were the wind and the pop of the green wood. The silence stretched, becoming brittle and thin, ready to shatter. Mercy could not bear it. She had to say something. Not about Jonah, not about Colorado, but something true. She felt if she did not put one true thing into the air, she would choke on all the lies. "My mother left me," she said, her voice sounding strange and loud in the quiet. Callan did not move, but she knew he was listening. His stillness was absolute. "At an orphanage in St. Louis." She stared at her own hands, seeing the past in their lines. "She told me she was going to find work. She told me she'd be back in a week. She had a blue dress. I remember that. Cornflower blue." She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "I waited. Every day. I waited by the gate. For a year, I watched for that blue dress." She gave a small, dry laugh. "She never came back." She looked up. Callan was still staring into the fire, but his jaw was so tight it looked carved from stone. His hand, resting on his knee, was clenched into a white-knuckled fist. He said nothing. He offered no word of comfort, no shared story. He just sat there, absorbing her pain into his own vast, cold silence. After a long time, he stood up, banked the fire, and went to his cot. But Mercy felt something had passed between them, a raw, unvarnished piece of truth. It was a terrible and fragile bond. The blizzard broke. The world returned, blindingly white under a pale, weak sun. But the snow was deep, drifted high against the cabin and barn. Travel was impossible. They were still trapped. With the light, however, came new work. Callan sent Mercy into the small, freezing attic above the main room to search for a box of old tarps to help patch a wind-damaged section of the stable roof. She climbed the rickety ladder, pushing open the trap door into the frigid dark. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from her lantern. It smelled of dried herbs, old leather, and mice. Piled in the corners were boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten things. She found the tarps, but beside them was a small wooden chest. It was not locked. Her curiosity, a trait she usually kept beaten down, rose up. She lifted the lid. Inside were a few folded letters, a pressed flower, a child's carved bird, and under them, a leather-bound sketchbook. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. She sat on the dusty floor, the lantern by her side, and opened it. The drawings were beautiful. They were done with a confident, strong hand. There was the ranch, captured in stark charcoal lines. There was Wirt, asleep in his chair, his mouth open. There was Jonah, mending a bridle, his small face intense. There was Callan's horse, its eye intelligent and alive. Then the pages turned, and there was only her, a woman. She was drawn again and again, her profile, her hair pinned up, a stray curl escaping, her hands holding a wild rose, her figure, a silhouette, standing on the ridge, looking out at the valley. It was not a drawing of a stranger. It was a drawing of someone beloved. Mercy's heart ached. This was the woman whose ghost lived in Callan's eyes. This was the love he had lost. She closed the book, her hands shaking, and tucked it back into the chest, feeling like a thief. She grabbed the tarps and climbed down. Her mind was reeling. She had to know. She could not ask Callan. She waited until he was outside and cornered Wirt by the wood pile. She held her breath. "Wirt, in the attic. There's a sketchbook." Wirt's face darkened. He stopped splitting a log. "You got no business up there except for what you was sent for." "I know. I saw the drawings." Mercy pressed, her voice low. "The woman? Who was she?" Wirt sighed, a cloud of white breath. He spat a stream of tobacco. That was Ilara, his fiancée. The name landed like a stone. Ilara. She was here, lived in town, but was set to marry him. This ranch. He was building most of it for her. Wirt said, his gaze distant. Then the raid. About 4 years back, after the war, things was still unsettled. Reavers, they came through, hit the town. She was killed. He looked at Mercy, his eyes hard. He ain't been right since. He was a different man before. He was the one who drew them pictures. Now you know. Put it from your mind. And don't you never speak of it to him." Mercy nodded, her throat tight. She retreated to the cabin, the knowledge settling in her like a new cold. He was not just a man who had lost his brothers. He was a man who had lost his future. He was an artist who no longer drew. The cabin felt smaller than ever. Knowing about Ilara, sharing her own past, feeling his gaze on her when she hummed, it all wove together into a new, charged tension. It was no longer just fear or suspicion. It was a dangerous, unspoken intimacy. When he was near, her skin prickled. When he handed her a log for the fire, His fingers brushed hers, and it felt like a brand. She began to dream. She dreamed of him, but not the man from the barn. She dreamed of his hands, the ones that had drawn Alara's face, the ones that were scarred and calloused. In her dreams, those hands touched her cheek, gently, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She dreamed he looked at her with his cold eyes, but they were not cold. They were filled with a terrible, aching loneliness that matched her own. She would wake in her cot, in the deep, freezing black of the night, her body flushed and aching, her heart hammering. She would lie there, clutching the thin blanket, ashamed. She was a murderer, hiding in a dead woman's house. She was dreaming of a man who would hate her if he knew the truth. The tension had to break. It had been stretched too thin for too long. It happened on a gray afternoon. The world was silent, muffled by the snow. Mercy was cooking supper, frying salt pork in the heavy iron skillet. She was tired, on edge. Her movements were jerky. The hot grease popped, a loud, angry sizzle. A wave of it splashed up, over the rim, onto her hand and forearm. The pain was sharp, immediate. She cried out, a short, choked gasp, and dropped the spatula, which clattered to the floor. "Damn it," Wirt muttered, starting to rise. But Callan was faster. He was across the room in 2 strides, his chair scraping back. He was at her side before she had even processed the burn. "Give it to me," he commanded. His voice cut through her pain. He grabbed her arm. His grip was not gentle. It was firm, absolute. He pulled her to the dry sink, to the bucket of icy water. He shoved her hand and forearm into it. The cold was a new shock, so intense it drove the fire of the burn deep into her bones. She gasped, trying to pull away. "It's too cold." "Leave it," he ordered, his hand clamping on her shoulder, holding her in place. He held her there, his body a rigid wall behind her, until the shaking in her arms subsided and the pain dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. Then, just as quickly, he let her go. He turned, grabbed a strip of clean rag from a drawer. He came back to her. "Let me see." She held out her arm, trembling. The skin was red and angry, already blistering. He took her hand. His own were rough, calloused, but his touch as he blotted the skin dry was surprisingly careful. He wrapped the cloth around her forearm, his dark head bent to the task. She could feel his breath on her skin. She could smell him, the cold air, pine smoke, and something else, something uniquely him. He finished tying the knot, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. He did not let go. His thumb moved, just once, brushing over her pulse. Mercy's breath caught. She looked up. His eyes were on her, not cold, not angry. They were dark, intent, and filled with a raw hunger that stripped her bare. The entire cabin, the entire world, vanished. There was only the fire crackling, the smell of burning pork, and the electric heat of his hand on her skin. It held 1 second, 2, a lifetime. Then the panic crashed in. This was what she had run from. This was the power that men had. The look in his eyes was the same as the sheriff's son's, not the cruelty, but the wanting, the taking. He was the man who had loved Alara. He was the man who had cried for Abel. This was a line she could not cross. She snatched her hand back as if she, too, had been burned. "I'll be fine," she whispered, her voice rough. She turned away from him, back to the hearth, putting her uninjured hand on the rough stone to steady herself. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Wirt and Jonah were frozen, watching. Mercy stared at the flames, her heart hammering. "The snow is melting. I saw the south ridges clear. The road should be passable in a day or 2. She took a shaky breath, the words tasting like ash. "I'll be leaving then." She heard no movement behind her, but she felt his stillness. It was a cold, dangerous thing. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was worse. It was a low, clipped snap, full of ice. "Do what you want." She flinched as he grabbed his coat from the peg. The cabin door was wrenched open, letting in a blast of freezing air. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the tins on the shelf rattled and a puff of soot fell from the chimney. Mercy closed her eyes, clutching her bandaged arm. The cabin was suddenly terribly cold. Later, long after Wirt and Jonah were asleep, she lay on her cot, wide awake. The cabin was dark, and she heard it. The sound of boots on the porch, a heavy measured tread on the frozen boards. Crunch, turn, crunch, turn. He was pacing back and forth, from one end of the porch to the other. He was not walking off anger. He was a wolf, walking the perimeter of its cage, trapped by the snow, trapped by her, trapped by himself. Crunch, turn, crunch, turn. The sound went on for hours, a grim heartbeat in the frozen, silent night. The sound that woke Mercy was the drip of water, a steady, persistent dripping from the eaves. The wind had finally stopped its high, keening wail. She lay on her cot, listening, and for the first time in weeks, she heard the world outside the cabin. The snow was melting. Her stomach tightened. The thaw was not a relief. It was a sentence. The road would be passable. Her borrowed time was over. That morning, the tension in the cabin was a brittle, cold thing. Callan had resumed his silence. His face, when he came in from the barn, was a mask of indifference, as if his furious pacing on the porch had never happened. He did not speak to her, did not even look at her. He had snapped, "Do what you want," and his silence now seemed to add, "And I see you have not done it." She had said she was leaving. Now, she had to. She spent the afternoon in the quiet corner by her cot. She was not packing. She had almost nothing to pack. She was mending her only dress. The wool was thin, the tear in the skirt long and ragged from her desperate ride up the mountain. She pulled her needle through the fabric, her stitches small and tight, a useless attempt at order. She worked, her head bent, the light from the window gray and weak. A hot tear splashed onto the dark wool. She wiped it away, her throat aching. She had not cried when she fled Colorado. She had not cried when the Gables turned her away. But she cried now, in the suffocating safety of this cabin. The tears came silently, blurring her vision. She was crying for the warmth of the fire, for the gruffness of Wirt, for the simple, heavy weight of the blankets. She was mending her dress to go back into a world that wanted to see her hang. She was leaving the only place she had been safe, and the man whose rage and grief felt so terribly, dangerously familiar. "You're really going?" Mercy's needle stopped. Jonah stood before her, his small face pinched with worry. He had been watching her for some time, his usual skittish energy replaced by a heavy dread. She tried to smile, but it felt like a grimace. "The road is clearing. Jonah, I was only hired for a few days. Remember?" "But that was weeks ago," he argued, his voice high. "The snow. You had to stay." "The snow is melting," she said softly, turning her attention back to the stitch. "But you can't." He took a step closer, his hands twisting the hat he held. Wirt says, Mr. Hayes is just being stubborn. He likes your biscuits. I like 'em." "I'll leave the recipe, Jonah." "It ain't the biscuits," he snapped, his childish frustration breaking. He stomped his boot on the plank floor. "It ain't." Mercy looked up. His eyes were bright, brimming with an angry, frightened plea. It was cold here," he whispered, his bravado vanishing. "Before you came, it was always cold, even by the fire." He looked down, his shoulders hunching. "You made it warm. You're the first one who made the place feel warm." The word struck Mercy harder than a blow. "You made it warm." She thought of her own mother, of the gate at the orphanage, of the cornflower blue dress she had watched for until her eyes burned. Now she was the one leaving. She was abandoning this boy, just as she had been abandoned. "Oh, Jonah," she whispered, her voice breaking. She set the dress aside. She reached out, and this time, he did not flinch. She pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapping around his thin, bony frame. He was stiff for a moment, shocked by the contact, and then he dissolved against her, his small arms locked around her waist, his face burrowing into her apron. He did not sob, but she felt the tremors running through him, a desperate, silent fight against the inevitable. She held him tight, her own eyes squeezed shut, the smell of hay and wood smoke rising from his hair. "I am a bad lady," she thought. The old refrain, "I am a killer, I am a coward, and now I am breaking this child's heart." She pulled back, her hands on his shoulders. "You are a good, strong boy. Jonah, you'll be fine." "No, I won't," he mumbled, his face defiant. "He'll be mean again." "He's not mean," she found herself saying, a fierce, protective instinct rising. "He's just lost." "Don't go, Miss Mercy, please!" "I have to." The words were lead. He saw the finality in her eyes. The hope in his face died, replaced by a closed, familiar emptiness. He pulled away from her, grabbed his coat, and fled the cabin, slamming the door. The cabin was too small. The silence was too loud. Mercy felt the walls closing in. Jonah's plea, Callan's stony silence. The mended dress, it was all too much. She needed air. She needed to escape. She pulled on her own thin coat, her healing arm throbbing with a dull ache, and walked out. She did not go to the barn. She walked past it, pushing through the deep, wet snow, her boots sinking, climbing the high ridge that overlooked the ranch. The air up here was thin and sharp. It cut at her lungs. She reached the crest, a place where the wind had swept the snow thinner, revealing the granite bones of the mountain. The valley spread out below her, a vast, blinding bowl of white, cut through by the dark, swollen artery of the thawing creek. The sky was a pale, bruised gray. It was beautiful and terrifyingly empty. This was the wild. It was what she had run to. She stood there, her hair torn from its pins by the wind, and thought. She thought of Purgatory Bend. She thought of the sheriff's son, Thomas, his fleshy face, his whiskey breath, the way he had ripped her dress. She saw again his shocked expression when she shoved the paring knife into him. She had felt the resistance of his ribs, the sick, soft give of his belly. She had killed him. She was a murderer. Her fingers, shoved deep in her pockets, began to tremble. She was wanted. A piece of paper with her name on it was probably tacked to a wall in a marshal's office. She had brought that stain here, to this remote place. She had put this boy, Jonah, and this broken man, Callan, in danger. She closed her eyes. It would be so easy to just lie down, to let the wind and the cold take her. It would be clean. It would be an end to the running. A boot crunched in the snow behind her. She spun, her heart leaping into her throat, a small cry escaping her. Callan. He stood 10 feet away, his own heavy coat on, his rifle looped over his back. He had followed her. He was just watching her, his face grim, the wind pulling at his dark hair. "It's cold up here," he said. His voice was not angry. It was flat. "I needed air," she replied. Her voice shook. He nodded, as if he understood. He moved, not toward her, but beside her, to stand at the edge of the ridge, his gaze on the far mountains. They stood in silence, 2 small figures against the vast, cold emptiness. "You're like a spooked doe," he said, his voice low, still looking out. "Ready to bolt at any shadow?" Mercy wrapped her arms around her chest. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were the color of winter, clear and cold. "The man at the trading post. The one Jonah heard, from Colorado, he was asking after a fugitive whore, That's what Jonah said Wirt told him. One who killed a man. Mercy stopped breathing. This was it. The accusation. The judgment. He didn't use a name. Callan continued, his gaze steady, pinning her. But it was you, wasn't it? She could not lie. Not here, not to him. She managed a small, jerky nod. The admission hung in the frozen air between them. She braced herself. For the disgust, the order to leave, the cold fury. He watched her, his expression unchanged. Then he looked back at the valley. You don't have to run forever, he said, so quietly she almost lost the words to the wind. Her head snapped up. She stared at his profile. You don't believe him? I believe he's hunting you, Callan stated. I believe you're running, but I've seen bad ladies. I've seen killers. They don't mend a boy's mittens. They don't cry quiet when they think no one's watching. He turned to face her fully, his body blocking the wind. You ain't what they say. It was not a question. It was a declaration. He was not turning her in. He was not casting her out. He was absolving her. You don't know, she whispered, the tears freezing on her cheeks. You don't know what I did. I know you're terrified, he said, his voice rough. I know you've been hurt. The way you flinched when I grabbed your arm. The way you look at the door every time the wind blows. He took a step closer. I don't care what happened in Colorado. That's the past. This is here. He reached out, his gloved hand moving slowly. He brushed the frozen tears from her cheek with his thumb. It was a rough, simple, clumsy touch, and it broke her. The dam of fear and loneliness and guilt she had held back for months, for years, just shattered. She doubled over, weeping, harsh, ragged sobs that were torn from her chest. Callan did not touch her. He did not pull her into his arms or offer soft words. He just stood there, his presence a solid, unmoving anchor in the storm of her grief. He bore witness. He let her break. When the worst of it passed, she straightened, wiping her face with her frozen glove, her body shaking. I have to go, she said, her voice ruined. I'll bring them here, to you, to Jonah. Let them come, he said. She stared at him, stunned. You'd fight them for me. I'd fight them, he said, his voice flat. It was not a boast, it was a fact. He turned. It's getting dark. Go back. Make supper. It was an order, but it was not the order of a boss. It was the order of a man telling her to live. He started down the ridge, his long strides sure in the deep snow, not looking back to see if she would follow. She returned to the cabin a different woman. The tremor was gone. Her hands were steady. You ain't what they say. The words were a shield. He had stood with her. She did not go to her cot. She did not pick up the mended dress. She went to the pantry. She built up the fire until it roared. She pulled down the last of the smoked beef. She found the sack of onions, the remaining potatoes in the cellar bin. She was going to make stew. She worked with a focused, quiet energy. She chopped, she stirred, she tasted. The cabin filled with the rich, deep smell of simmering beef and herbs. It was the smell of a home, not a refuge. Wirt and Jonah came in from the barn, stamping snow from their boots. They stopped, their noses twitching. Lord Almighty, girl, Wirt said, his eyes wide. You aiming to feed an army with that? It's a cold night, Mercy said. She looked at Jonah. He was watching her, his expression wary. He saw she was not packing. He saw the way she moved, the set of her jaw. A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. She returned it. She served them, filling their bowls. They ate, Wirt with a loud, appreciative slurping, Jonah with a quiet, new hope. Then Callan came in. He stopped at the door, the cold air swirling around him. He took in the scene, the roaring fire, the thick, savory smell. His eyes met Mercy's. She served Wirt and Jonah. They finished, full and warm. the stew heavy in their bellies. They were tired from a long day of fighting the heavy, wet snow. "I'll bank the fire," Mercy said to Wirt, her voice clear. "Aye," he said, grunting as he rose from the table. "That's a fine stew. Sits proper." He and Jonah retreated to their cots, and within minutes, the sound of their deep, even breathing filled the room. Callan had not moved. He stood by the door, watching her. Mercy took a breath. She went to the shelf and took down 2 clean tin plates. She ladled the thick stew onto both. She took 2 spoons. She walked to the small table by the fire, the one that was separate from the long trestle table, the one where he sometimes sat alone. She set the table. For 2. She looked at him, her heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm. "Your supper's ready, Mr. Hayes." He moved, shrugging out of his heavy coat. He did not hang it. He let it fall to the floor. He walked to the table and sat opposite her. The firelight flickered between them, casting deep, dancing shadows on the angles of his face. They ate in silence. It was not the suffocating, angry silence of the morning. It was a shared, listening quiet. The stew was hot, the best she had ever made. He finished, placing his spoon carefully on the empty plate. He stared at her. "You set this table," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" "You told me to make supper," she said. "That's not what I mean." Mercy put her own spoon down. "You stood with me on the ridge. You didn't hate me." "Hate you?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Girl, I don't have that much left in me." He leaned forward, his arms on the table. That gesture, setting the table, Ilara used to do that. Mercy's heart dropped. Of course, she was a ghost, sitting in a dead woman's place. "No," he said, his voice sharp, as if he'd read her mind. "Not like that. She did it. Because it was proper. Because it was what ladies were supposed to do. You." He searched for the words. "You did it as an answer." He looked away from her, into the flames. The simple domestic act had undone him. "You think you're the only one," he said, his voice dropping, becoming rough and thick. "You think you're the only one with blood on your hands, the only one who ran." He picked up his tin cup, his knuckles white. "Abel, my brother, my youngest brother." He spoke the name he had cried in the barn, but now it was a flat, dead thing. "He was 17. He shouldn't have been in Kansas. He wanted to be like me." Callan stared at the wall, but he was seeing the past. We were ambushed, a border patrol, just reavers pretending to be law. It wasn't even a real fight. It was just cold and bullets from the trees. He stopped. Mercy did not move. She did not breathe. "He took a shot, in the gut. He fell from his horse. I got him behind a rock, but they had us pinned. It was getting dark. The snow was blue. It was so cold." He swallowed. He was in pain. He was crying for our mother, and they were getting closer. The other 2 men with me, they said we had to run, had to leave him. Callan closed his eyes, his face rigid. He knew. He looked at me, and he knew. He stopped crying. He just said, "Go, Cal, don't let him get you too." So I went. I ran. I left him there. His voice broke. I left him to die, frozen and shot. I saved myself. He opened his eyes. They were hollow, haunted. "So don't you talk to me about killing?" he whispered. "I hear him every time the wind blows." He sat back, his confession a gaping wound in the small, warm room. He looked at his hands on the table, scarred and calloused. "I ain't been touched in 4 years, he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "Not since Ilara, not with care." The words hung in the air. Not with care. Mercy thought of the whip scars on his back. She thought of his grief. He had shown her his deepest shame. He expected her to recoil. She stood up, her chair scraped on the floor. He flinched, his eyes closing, expecting her to walk away. She did not. She walked around the table and stood beside him. He was tense, a coiled spring of grief and anger. Slowly, her hand trembling, Mercy reached out. She touched his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, cold from the outside, but hot beneath. He froze. His entire body went rigid. He did not breathe. Then, a shudder ran through him. His eyes closed, and he leaned into her palm. An involuntary, desperate movement, like a starving man offered bread. She did not pull away. She left her hand there, her palm against the hard line of his jaw. She felt the tremor in his muscles. He turned his head, his movement rough, and pressed his mouth to her palm. It was not a kiss. It was a brand, a desperate, broken gesture of a man starved for any human kindness. He stood, his chair scraping back. He was tall, looming over her in the firelight, but his eyes were not cold. They were wide, raw, and full of a drowning need that she recognized. It was the same need she felt in her own gut. He did not grab her. He raised his own scarred, rough hand and mirrored her. He touched her cheek. His fingers were hesitant, clumsy, as if he had forgotten how. His thumb brushed the hair back from her temple. Mercy, he whispered. Her name, not girl. All the barriers, the past, the fear, the ghosts of Alara and Abel and Thomas, they all dissolved. In the flickering light, they were just two people, impossibly broken, impossibly alone. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was slow and desperate and raw. It was clumsy. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten, and a woman who had never known. It was not gentle. It was full of 4 years of loneliness and a lifetime of running. It tasted of salt from his confession and of the tears that were now, finally, streaming down her face. She did not pull back. She kissed him, her hands coming up to grip the rough wool of his shirt, holding on, anchoring herself. He made a low sound in his throat, a sound of pain and release. His arm clamped around her waist, pulling her hard against his body. He was solid, strong, real. He buried his face in her neck. God, he breathed, his voice muffled against her skin. You're warm. He was shaking. The man who was as hard as the mountains was shaking in her arms. He lifted her. She was light, and he carried her the few feet to his cot, the one covered in a thick bearskin. He laid her down, his movements careful, almost reverent. He looked down at her, his face a mask of conflict, desire warring with a grief so deep it was part of his bones. Callan, she whispered. It was all the permission he needed. They made love in the flickering shadows. It was not perfect. It was slow and desperate and emotional. It was awkward and real. It was two damaged souls fumbling for solace. It was his rough hands on her skin, touching her with a reverence that made her want to weep. It was her, clinging to his broad, scarred back, finding a strength she had never known. He was inside her, and he paused, his forehead pressed to hers, his eyes squeezed shut, his body rigid as he fought for a control he had not needed in years. When it was over, they lay tangled in the blankets, their bodies slick, the fire burning low. He did not release her. He held her, his arm a heavy, possessive weight across her ribs, as if she might evaporate. He was quiet for so long. She thought he had fallen asleep. Then, his voice, a low rumble against her ear, rough with emotion. Stay. It was not a command, it was a plea. And Mercy, who had run from St. Louis, who had run from Colorado, who had cried at the gate of an orphanage, felt the last of her defenses crumble. She turned in his arms, buried her face in the hard warmth of his chest, and sobbed. Morning came with a sharp, brilliant blue sky. Mercy woke slowly, cocooned in a warmth she had never known. She was in Callan's cot, his body curved around hers, his heavy arm still draped over her waist. He was asleep, his breathing deep and even. She felt safe. The feeling was so new, so fragile. It was almost painful. She lay still, not daring to move, just feeling the solid, living presence of him. She remembered everything: the ridge, the stew, the touch. Stay. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. Carefully, she slipped from his hold. The floor was ice cold on her bare feet. She pulled on her dress, her movements silent, and went to the hearth to build the fire. She had to make coffee. She glanced out the single window, rubbing a clear patch in the frost. The world was blinding white, sparkling under a bright, cold sun. The thaw was real. She looked out at the valley, at the vast, shining expanse, and she saw it. At first, it was just a speck, a tiny, dark spot on the horizon, miles down, following the dark, emerging line of the creek. Her blood turned to ice. It was not Wirt. It was not Jonah. It was a single rider, moving steadily, deliberately toward the ranch. Mercy's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. The blood drained from her face, the fragile, newborn warmth vanishing, replaced by the familiar, freezing grip of terror. The past was not done with her. It was riding toward them. The coffee pot in her hand was still empty. Mercy stood frozen at the window, her body rigid, the new, fragile warmth of the morning leaching from her skin. The speck was larger now. It was definitely a man, on a horse, moving with the slow, steady pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going. A floorboard creaked behind her. "Mercy?" Callan's voice was thick with sleep, rough from the night. He was standing by the cot, pulling on his pants, his scarred chest bare in the gray light. He saw her face. He saw the way she was clutching the coffee pot, her knuckles white. He saw the direction of her gaze. He was at the window in 2 strides, his sleepiness vanishing, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He looked out, his eyes narrowing, tracking the rider. "How long?" he asked. "Just saw him. He's following the creek." Callan swore, a low, vicious sound. He turned, pulling on his shirt. "Wirt, get up! Trouble!" The old ranch hand was awake instantly, rolling from his bunk, his eyes already clear. "What?" "Rider, coming up from the valley, 1 man." Wirt was at the door, peering out. "He ain't lost. He's coming straight for us." Mercy's breath was shallow, caught in her throat. She could not move. It was happening. The outside world, the one she had fled, was here. The fragile bubble of the ranch had burst. "Jonah!" Callan snapped. The boy was already awake, his eyes wide and frightened. "Go to the barn. Feed the horses. Do not come out. Do not make a sound. Understand?" Jonah nodded, grabbing his coat and slipping out the back way. "Mercy," Callan said. Her head whipped toward him. His face was granite. The man who had held her, who had whispered, "Stay," was gone. In his place was the hard, cold stranger she had first met. "Go to your cot. Sit down. Do not speak. Do not look at him. You are the cook. You are simple. You understand." She nodded, her limbs feeling like lead. She put the coffee pot on the cold stove and retreated to the dark corner, sitting on the edge of her cot, her hands twisting in her lap. Callan strapped his gun belt on. He did not put on his coat. He stood by the door, waiting. Wirt stood by the fireplace, his old rifle cradled in his arms. The sound of the horse grew closer, a slow, steady hoofbeat in the wet snow. It stopped in the yard. A man's voice called out, unhurried, "Hello, the house." Callan opened the door, stepping out onto the porch, blocking the entrance. He stood relaxed, his hand nowhere near his gun, but his whole body was a coiled spring. Mercy watched through the crack in the door. The rider was tall, thin, and wore a long, oilskin duster. He had a narrow face, pale eyes, and a beard that needed trimming. He looked like a man who had spent too many weeks on the trail. He sat his horse easily, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, taking in the barn, the lean-to, the smoke from the chimney. "Mornin'," Callan said, his voice flat. "Looking for something?" "Maybe," the man said. His voice was reedy. "Name's Hale. I'm a tracker, from Colorado." Mercy's heart stopped. "Looking for a woman," Hale continued, his eyes resting on Callan. "Name of Beckett, Mercy Beckett, runs kitchen work. 'Bout this high." He gestured. "Dark hair, quiet." "Don't know her," Callan said. Hale smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "That's what they said at the Gable Ranch. 'Cept the boy at the trading post said different. Said he saw a woman just like her, riding this way. 'Bout 2 weeks back, said she looked spooked. This is the last stop on this ridge." "We ain't seen her," Callan said. "Just me and my hands." Hale's gaze drifted past Callan, into the dark cabin. Mercy held her breath, willing herself to be invisible. He couldn't see her. He couldn't. "Mind if I water my horse?" Hale asked, his eyes coming back to Callan. "Wirt," Callan said, not turning. "Water his horse. Show him the track down to the river. Might be he's looking for the old trapper's line." Wirt came out, rifle in hand. He nodded to Hale. "This way. The creek's high, but the track's clear if you know where to look. We seen sign. Maybe downriver. 'Bout a week ago. Could be your woman. Could be Rapaho." Hale's eyes narrowed. He was suspicious. He looked from Wirt's rifle to Callan's cold, steady gaze. He was one man, and these were two, on their own land. He had no warrant, just suspicion. "Appreciate it," Hale said. He swung his horse around, following Wirt toward the trough. "But she's wanted, real bad. Murder. Killed the sheriff's son in Purgatory Bend." He spat into the snow. "There's a hefty reward for the fugitive whore." He let the words hang in the air, a final warning. Callan just watched him. "Good luck with your hunt," he said, and turned, walking back into the cabin. He shut the door. Mercy had not moved. She was pale as snow, her entire body shaking. The words echoed in the room. "Fugitive whore. Murder." Callan walked to the window. He watched as Wirt pointed downriver, his arm gesturing. He watched as Hale nodded, turned his horse, and began the slow ride away from the ranch, heading down into the lower valley. Only when the man was a small speck, disappearing behind the first line of pines, did Callan turn. Mercy was on her feet. She was grabbing her thin coat from the peg. She was stuffing her mended dress into the small, battered satchel she had arrived with. Her movements were frantic, panicked. "What are you doing?" Callan's voice was low. "He's gone. I have to go," she whispered, her voice choked. "I have to go now, before he realizes Wirt lied, before he circles back." "He'll circle back," Callan agreed. "That's his kind. He's a tracker. He'll find the snow's too deep downriver, and he'll come back." "Then I have to be gone," she said, tears of terror streaming down her face. "Callan, you lied for me. You harbored me. That's a crime. He'll bring the law on you. I won't do that. I won't." She fumbled with the satchel's buckle. He crossed the room and clamped his hand over hers. "No." "You can't stop me," she sobbed. "I brought this here. I have to take it away." He grabbed her arms, his grip hard, forcing her to look at him. "And go where? Back into the snow? He'll track you. He'll find you in a day. You'll be half frozen and helpless. It's not your concern." "I'm making it my concern," he growled. He looked into her terrified eyes, his own blazing with a cold fury. "Listen to me, Mercy. If you run now, you will never stop running. You will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Every time a horse stops in the street, every time a man looks at you too long, You'll be on the run again. Is that what you want?"
"It's all I have."
"No, it's not," he said, his voice dropping. "You stop here. You stop now. We fight this. We don't run." "Fight who? The law? His family has money. They have power. You have nothing." "I have this," he said, his gaze sweeping the cabin. "This ranch, my name, and I have you." She stared at him, his words sinking in, warring with the panic that was screaming at her to flee. "Is it true?" The small voice cut through the tension like a knife. They both turned. Jonah stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terrible, adult knowledge. He had not gone to the barn. He had hidden on the porch, under the window. He had heard every word. "Jonah!" Callan started, his voice rough. But the boy's eyes were on Mercy. He looked utterly betrayed. "He called you that word. He said you killed a man." His lip trembled. "Is it true, Miss Mercy? Are you really a killer?" Mercy looked at his small, horrified face. The lie died in her throat. She could lie to Callan. She could lie to Wirt. She could not lie to this child. She pulled her arms from Callan's grasp and slowly sank onto the bench by the table. She held out her hand. "Jonah, come here." He hesitated. Then, slowly, warily, he approached. "Sit," she said. He sat, his body rigid, as far from her as the bench would allow. Mercy took a deep, shaky breath, her gaze fixed on her own hands, clasped in her lap. "Yes," she whispered. "I killed a man." Jonah flinched, as if she had struck him. "His name was Thomas," Mercy continued, her voice flat, recounting the story as if it had happened to someone else. "He was the son of the sheriff in Purgatory Bend, Colorado. I worked in the kitchen of the saloon. He came in. He was drunk. He tried to hurt me." She looked at Jonah. "He was stronger than me. He tore my dress. He said I was there for him to use." She did not soften the words. She gave him the hard, ugly truth. "I found a knife, a paring knife. I stabbed him." She looked down again. "I didn't wait to see what happened. I just ran. I stole a horse, and I ran." She looked up at the boy. His face was a mixture of confusion and hurt. "His family is rich. They are the law. Even if he didn't die, it doesn't matter. There would be no trial for me. They would just hang me. He was their son. I am nobody." She had laid her shame bare. She waited for his judgment, for him to run from her as he had before. Jonah was quiet for a long time. He stared at the floor, his boot tracing a line in the dirt. He had heard the cruelty. He understood. He lived in a world where strength was often the only law. He finally looked up, his eyes still troubled, but the fear was gone. "So, you ain't bad," he said. It was a statement. "You just fought back." "I killed him, Jonah," she said, the words heavy as stones. "He was gonna hurt you," the boy insisted, a flash of anger in his own eyes. "He was like those men who beat the horses at the post. They're bad, not the horse." Mercy felt a tear roll hot down her cheek. Jonah saw it. He hesitated. Then he slid across the bench. He wrapped his thin, small arms around her waist and squeezed, his face pressed into her stomach. He held on tight, just as he had when he begged her not to leave. "It's all right," he mumbled into her apron. "I'm still glad you're here. I still like your bread better than anyone's." Mercy's hands came up, clutching his small back, and she wept, her shoulders shaking. Callan watched them, his face unreadable, his jaw tight. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving them alone. The argument came that night. The fragile piece of Jonah's forgiveness had settled, but the larger problem remained. Hale was out there. Callan, Mercy, and Wirt sat at the table. Jonah was asleep, or pretending to be. "He'll be back," Callan said, his voice final. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 2 days. He won't find a track downriver, and he'll come back. We can fight him off, Wirt said, spitting tobacco juice into the can. He's 1 man, we're 3.5, he added, nodding toward Mercy. He won't come back alone, Callan said. He'll go to town. He'll get a warrant or a posse. He'll use the law.
So what do we do?
Mercy asked, her voice low. We can't just shoot him. No, Callan said. He looked at her, his gaze steady. I'm riding to town at dawn. Mercy's blood ran cold.
Town? Cheyenne? No, Callan, no!
It's the only way, he said, cutting off her protest. I'm going to the U.S. Marshal. I'm going to tell him the truth. I'm going to tell him a bounty hunter is harassing my ranch, that he's threatening my cook. I'll post a bond. I'll hire a lawyer. We'll fight them with the same law they're using.
They'll arrest you,
Mercy cried, jumping to her feet.
They'll arrest you for harboring me. They'll take the ranch. Callan, his family is powerful. You said it yourself. You can't win.
I can't run, he countered, his voice rising, his own anger meeting hers. He stood, slamming his hand on the table. The tin plates jumped. I'm done running. Mercy, I left my brother to die in the snow because I ran. I won't fail again.
This isn't failing,
she pleaded, coming around the table, grabbing his arm.
This is living. This is surviving. If you go to town, you'll be shot or you'll be jailed.
What good is that? What good is your pride if you're dead?
It ain't pride, he roared, his face close to hers. It's about stopping. It's about standing on a piece of ground and saying, this far, no more. This man, Thomas, he tried to hurt you. He tried to take your life, and his family is trying to finish the job. We don't let them. We don't let them win.
I don't care if they win,
she sobbed, hitting his chest with her fist.
I care if you live. Please, Callan, just for me, let's ride out.
We can go north, to the mountains. We can go where no one knows us. And what? He grabbed her wrists. Live in a cave? Look over our shoulders forever? That ain't living. That's just waiting to die. His words hung in the air, a terrible, cold truth. I won't let you, she whispered, her fight draining away, replaced by a cold dread. I won't let you go.
You can't stop me.
He pulled her to him. The anger, the fear, the desperation of the day. It all broke. He kissed her. It was not the slow, desperate discovery of the night before. This was a claiming. It was rough, punishing, and deep, a raw expression of his fear and his resolve. He was kissing her goodbye. She fought him for a second, her hands pushing against his chest, and then she melted. She kissed him back with all the terror and love and desperation she had. This was their last night. She knew it. He swung her into his arms, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her to his cot. They made love like it was the end of the world. It was rougher, deeper, a frantic, passionate collision. It was not about solace. It was about defiance. It was a desperate attempt to hold on to each other, to burn themselves into each other's memory, before the world outside tore them apart. It was a fight and a surrender and a prayer, all at once. Afterward, they lay in the dark. The fire burned down to red embers. The cabin was silent, save for Wirt's soft snore and the sigh of the wind. Mercy lay with her head on Callan's chest, his arm like an iron band around her. The decision was made. The argument was over. Her voice was a small, broken thing in the dark. You said, when I first came, you said you'd hire a better cook. She felt his chest move as he took a breath. You're riding to town, she whispered. You can find one, someone who isn't wanted, someone who won't bring trouble. She was giving him an out, a last chance to save himself. Don't lie to me now, Callan, not now. He was silent for a long moment. Then his arm tightened, pulling her so close she could barely breathe. He rolled, shifting his weight, his face above hers in the deep shadows. His voice was a low, rough growl, an unbreakable vow. "I was wrong. I don't want a better cook. I want you." Before the sun had even touched the eastern ridge, he was up. The cabin was gray and cold. Mercy watched him, her heart a cold knot of dread. He dressed silently, his heavy wool pants, his shirt, his coat. He checked his rifle. He loaded his revolver, his movements economical and precise. He walked to the small, rickety desk in the corner, the one where he kept his ledgers. He opened a drawer and took out a single, folded piece of paper. He walked back to her. She was sitting up in the cot, the blanket clutched to her chest. He held it out. It was the paper she had signed the day she arrived, her hand shaking so badly she could barely write. A simple contract. Mercy Beckett, cook, temporary, room and board and $10 a month. She looked at it, then at his hard, set face. He did not speak. He walked to the hearth, where the new kindling was just beginning to catch. He knelt and tossed the paper into the flames. They watched it together. The edges curled, turning brown, then black. The word temporary flared bright orange, and then it was gone, reduced to a fragile, floating piece of ash, a symbol. He stood. He came to the cot and pulled her to her feet. He kissed her. It was not passionate. It was hard, and brief, and final. "Bar the door behind me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone but me or Wirt. Keep the rifle loaded. Callan." "Bar the door, Mercy." He turned and was gone. The door shut, leaving her in the cold, gray light. She heard him speak to Wirt outside, the low murmur of instructions. She heard the creak of saddle leather, the soft snort of his horse. Then hoofbeats, moving away from the ranch, heading east, toward town, toward the law. Mercy walked to the door and dropped the heavy wooden bar into its brackets. She went to the window, the one where she had seen the rider, and watched him go. She watched his figure grow smaller, a solitary man against the vast, white, unforgiving land. She watched until he was just a speck, just like the bounty hunter had been, and then he was gone. She was alone. The cabin was silent, and the agony of waiting began. The ride to Cheyenne was a long torment of melting snow and sucking mud. Callan Hayes pushed his horse hard, his mind not on the trail, but on the woman he had left behind. He had left her with a rifle and a barred door, prey to the very men he was riding to confront. It was Abel all over again, a person left behind, defenseless, while he saved himself. No, he thought, his jaw setting. Not this time. This was not a retreat. This was an attack. He rode for hours, the snow-capped peaks giving way to the high, wind-scoured plains that surrounded the territorial capital. Cheyenne was a raw, booming town of new brick, false-fronted stores, and deep, churning mud. It smelled of coal smoke, manure, and money. He skipped the saloon, skipped the land office. He tied his horse outside the Laramie County Sheriff's office, the mud sucking at his boots as he dismounted. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Brody, was thick-bodied and had a mustache stained with tobacco. He looked up, annoyed by the cold draft Callan brought in. "Help you?" "My name is Callan Hayes. I run a ranch up in the high country," Callan said, his voice low, his coat dripping water onto the floor. "I've got a problem." "Ranchers always got problems." Brody grunted, leaning back in his chair. "Cattle, weather, or Indians? What's yours?" "Bounty hunters. A man named Hale from Colorado came onto my land yesterday, claiming to be hunting a woman, a cook I hired." Brody's eyes sharpened. He sat forward. "A woman, dark hair, quiet? You know her." "I know of her," Brody corrected. He pulled a stack of telegraph wires from a spindle on his desk. He shuffled through them. "Beckett, Mercy Beckett. Wanted out of Purgatory Bend. Murder. Stabbed the sheriff's son. Callan held the man's gaze.
She was attacked. She was defending herself.
Brody snorted. That's what they all say. Fact is, she's got a warrant. Murder. Mr. Hayes. You're harboring a fugitive. That's a federal crime. The man who came to my ranch, this Hale, he had no warrant, Callan said, his voice dropping, cold and precise. He had no badge. He was threatening. He lied about his charge. He called her a fugitive whore and offered a reward. That's not law. Sheriff, that's a mob. It's a fine line out here. I'm drawing it. Callan said, This woman is on my property. She's under my protection. This Hale is operating on a private bounty. That's illegal in this territory, and I'm here to make it stop. Brody studied Callan. He saw the coldness in his eyes, the set of his jaw. This was not a man to be trifled with. He sighed, annoyed. He looked back at the telegraph wires, shuffling them again. It's a messy business. Hayes, Brody admitted, his tone shifting. You're right. The official warrant is thin. The one from Colorado, anyway. He squinted at the paper.
But the charge? Wait a minute.
He pulled a different wire from the bottom of the stack, one that had come in just that morning. Well, it ain't murder. Callan froze.
What?
The man she stabbed, Thomas Grady, he ain't dead. The words hit Callan like a physical blow. Not dead. Brody tapped the paper. Got this from the U.S. Marshal in Denver. It seems Sheriff Grady, the boy's father, has been exaggerating. The boy ain't dead. She stabbed him. All right, in the gut. But when he went down, he hit his head on the cast iron stove. He's been in a coma ever since. Not dead, just gone. The law was shaky. The entire charge was built on a grieving, powerful father's lie. Callan leaned forward, pressing his advantage. So, she's not a murderer. She's a woman who defended herself from an assault, and the man injured himself when he fell. And this Hale is running around claiming murder to collect a $500 bounty from the boy's father. Looks that way. Brody conceded, wary. So you're going to let a Colorado sheriff's private army ride into your county and terrorize my ranch? Callan's voice was soft, but it held a core of absolute threat. Because if you do, Sheriff, my next stop is the circuit judge, and after that, I'm going to the Cheyenne leader. I'll tell every newspaper man in this town how the Laramie County Sheriff lets Colorado thugs run roughshod over Wyoming homesteaders. I wonder how that'll read. Come election time. Brody's face turned a dull red. He was beaten. He was a politician, and Callan had just aimed a bullet at his career.
Damn it, Hayes!
He swore. Standing up, he stalked to the front window. You've put me in a bind. I've given you the truth. Callan said, Now I need the law. Brody turned back, his mind made up. All right, here's what we do. He snatched a piece of paper and dipped a pen. I'm issuing a statement. This office, he underlined the word, does not recognize the private bounty on Mercy Beckett. The charge is assault, pending review by the marshal's office. She is to remain in the custody of her employer, you, until such time. Any attempt to remove her from your property by non-deputized agents will be met as trespassing and attempted kidnapping. He signed it with a flourish and sanded the ink. She is not wanted. Hayes, not here. He handed the document to Callan. It was a fragile shield, a piece of paper against a rich man's rage. But it was real. One more thing, Sheriff, Callan said, folding the paper. That bounty hunter, Hale, I want him run out of the territory, and any other man you find asking after her. Brody nodded, glad to be rid of him. Done. Now get out of my office. Callan walked out, the document safe in his coat. He had won. He felt no triumph. He felt only a cold dread. He had beaten the law, but he had not beaten the father. He untied his horse and spurred it toward home, racing the sinking sun. He was less than 10 miles from the ranch. riding through a narrow arroyo where the snowmelt ran fast. When the trap was sprung, it was not Hale. It was two men, hired thugs by the look of them, their faces stubbled and their eyes empty. They had been waiting for him, hidden in the pines above the cut. The first shot came without warning. It struck his horse in the neck. The animal screamed, a terrible, high sound, and collapsed, pitching Callan into the icy slush. He rolled, his training from the war taking over. He came up behind the dead animal, his revolver in his hand. A second bullet whined past his ear, chipping stone.
He's down, one shouted. Get his horse. Grady said make it look like a robbery, the other yelled.
Callan raised his gun, resting it on the saddle of his dead horse. He aimed, he breathed out, he fired. The man in the trees grunted, a wet, surprised sound, and toppled forward, sliding down the snowy embankment into the creek. The other man fired twice, wild, the bullets thudding into the horse's flank. Callan aimed again, but the second man was already running, crashing through the underbrush, his nerve broken. He was gone. Silence. The only sounds were the rushing water and the last, shuddering breath of his horse. Callan stayed behind the horse, his gun steady, for a full 5 minutes. Nothing. He was alone. He pushed himself up, his body aching from the fall. Then the pain hit him, a hot, sharp fire in his left side. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his coat. Just above his hip, he'd been hit. He tore open his coat. The bullet had gone clean through, high on his ribs. It wasn't mortal. Not yet, but it was bleeding. Fast. He cursed, tearing a strip from his shirt, wadding it against the wound under his coat. He was 10 miles from home, wounded, and Mercy was alone. He started to walk, then to limp, then to stagger, his boots heavy with mud and snow. He left his dead horse. He kept his revolver in his hand. He was driven by a single burning thought: Mercy. Back at the ranch, the second day of waiting was ending. The sun was a pale, watery smear in the west, and the shadows in the yard grew long and blue. Mercy stood on the porch, Callan's rifle in her hands. She had not put it down since he left. Wirt was in the barn, his mood darker than the approaching night. Jonah, unable to bear the tension, was checking the snare lines he'd set up the hill. Mercy scanned the ridgeline. She was looking for Callan. The rider who appeared came from the east, the same direction Callan had taken, but it was not Callan. This man was different from Hale. He was not a tracker. He was an enforcer. He was dressed in a black coat, his hat pulled low, and his eyes, when he got close enough for her to see them, were as cold and dead as river stones. He carried no rifle. He had 2 pistols strapped low on his hips. He did not call out. He rode straight into the yard, dismounted, and tied his horse to the post as if he owned it. "Mercy Beckett," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. It was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. "Who are you?" Mercy's voice was a dry whisper. She raised the rifle. The barrel trembled. "The name doesn't matter," the man said. He walked slowly toward the porch. "Sheriff Grady sent me. He's tired of waiting. You're coming with me." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The man smiled. It was a thin, reptilian movement of his lips. "I watched your man, Hayes, ride out yesterday. He ain't back. It's just you. And that old man in the barn." He kept walking. "Put the gun down, girl. I'm paid to bring you back breathing. But the old man, he's just in the way." "Stop!" she cried. "Get off this land." He stepped onto the first step of the porch. "I'm not asking." The barn door burst open. He said, "Get off the land." Wirt's voice boomed. He stood in the opening, his own rifle leveled at the man's chest. At the same moment, Jonah came running from the trees. Seeing the standoff, he didn't run to the cabin. He ran to Mercy's side. The man in black stopped. He looked at Wirt. He looked at Mercy. He looked at the boy. He slowly raised his hands. 3 guns to 1. That's not fair. He was mocking them.
Get on your horse,
Wirt growled. I don't think I will, the man said. The old man might hit me. The woman might, too. But that rifle's heavy for her. She's shaking. And the boy, he chuckled. I'll take my chances. His hand blurred, dropping toward his pistol. Drop it. The voice was a low, ragged snarl. They all froze. Callan stood at the corner of the barn. He was caked in mud, his face the color of gray ash. A huge, dark stain covered his entire left side. He was leaning against the log wall for support, but his revolver was in his right hand, and it was rock steady. The man in black turned, his eyes wide with surprise. Well, you look half dead. Cowboy. Last warning? Callan breathed. The hammer of his revolver clicked back. The sound was deafening in the cold. Still air. He aimed at the center of the man's chest. The man saw the look in Callan's eyes. This was not a rancher. This was a killer. He saw the blood. He saw the exhaustion. He saw a man with absolutely nothing left to lose.
Callan, no!
Mercy screamed. Her voice cut through his rage. He looked at her.
Not in front of Jonah,
she pleaded, her voice breaking. Callan's gaze locked with hers. He was on a knife's edge. He wanted this man dead. He needed to kill him, to end the threat, to prove he had not failed. He looked at Jonah, the boy's face white with terror, watching him. The man in black saw the hesitation. He was not a fool. He had seen that look before, too. The look of a man pulled back from the brink.
This ain't over,
the man snarled, his arrogance returning, but his hands were high. Grady will send more. He'll send an army.
Get out,
Callan whispered, his voice failing. The man needed no more encouragement. He backed away slowly, his hands in the air. He untied his horse, swung into the saddle, and spurred the animal, galloping out of the yard without a backward glance. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. Mercy dropped the rifle. It clattered on the porch boards. She ran. She flew across the yard, her feet slipping in the mud.
Callan,
she breathed, reaching him. Oh God, you're bleeding. He looked at her. He saw she was safe. He saw Wirt. He saw Jonah. He had made it. The iron will that had forced him to walk the last 10 miles. The rage that had held him upright. It all evaporated. His revolver fell from his numb fingers. His eyes rolled back. Mercy, he slurred. He collapsed. She caught him, his dead weight driving her to her knees in the mud. She threw her arms around him, holding him, his blood soaking the front of her dress.
Wirt! Jonah! Help me!
She screamed. They dragged him inside, a dead weight. Wirt, his face grim, tore open Callan's coat and shirt. The wound was ugly, raw, and caked with mud.
He's lost a sight of blood,
Wirt said, his voice low. A damn sight. Mercy, who had been frozen in terror for 2 days, was now a pillar of steel. The panic was gone, burned away by a cold, fierce purpose.
Jonah,
she snapped, her voice sharp, clear. Get snow, a bucket of clean snow, now. Wirt, get me the whiskey from his trunk and every clean rag you can find, and build up that fire, boil water, all of it. They scrambled to obey. She was no longer the cook. She was the one in command. She knelt by Callan's side. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. She bathed his face, her touch gentle. You are not leaving me, she whispered to him. You hear me, Callan Hayes? You stayed, now I stay. For 3 nights, she did not sleep. The fever set in, a raging fire that consumed him. He thrashed in the cot, his body burning. He cried out in his delirium. He was back in Kansas, in the snow, calling for his brother. Abel, hold on, don't let me go. I'm here, Mercy would whisper, gripping his hand.
her voice raw.
I have you. I'm not letting go.
Wirt and Jonah watched her. They brought her food she did not eat. Coffee she drank without tasting. She held a wet rag to his head, forced sips of water and broth between his cracked lips. She cleaned the wound. She stitched it closed herself, her hand steady as stone, her stitches as small and neat as the ones on her dress. On the third night, the fever was at its peak. His breathing was a harsh, shallow rattle. He was leaving. She could feel him slipping away. Wirt stood at the foot of the cot, his hat in his hands, his head bowed.
He's a fighter, Wirt murmured. But I think his fight's done.
No,
Mercy said, her voice fierce. She was exhausted, her eyes burning, her body aching. She bent close to Callan's ear, her spirit fighting his. You will not. You came back. You came back for me. You will not leave me now. He did not stir. She felt a terrible, cold despair, the same she had felt on the ridge. She had nothing left, only... She began to hum. It was the tune from her childhood, the wordless, simple melody she had hummed while baking. It was the only thing of comfort she had. She hummed, her voice cracked and soft. Then, finding a strength she did not know she possessed, she put words to it, simple words.
The sun goes down. The stars come out. You're safe right here. You're safe right now.
She sang to him, her voice quiet, a thin thread of life in the dark, fever-heavy cabin. She sang of the mountains, of the water, of the fire. She sang of staying. She sang as the fever raged. She sang as the night turned to gray dawn. She sang until her throat was raw, and she fell asleep, her head dropping onto the cot, her hand still locked in his. She woke to a touch. It was not the thrashing of the fever. It was a hand, weak but real. His fingers were moving, closing around hers. She lifted her head, her heart stopping. Callan's eyes were open. The fever was gone. They were his eyes, clear and sane, the color of a winter sky. He was looking at her. He was wet with sweat, weak, but he was there. He was back. He swallowed, his lips dry. His voice was a bare rasp. You're still here, he whispered. She choked back a sob, bringing his rough hand to her cheek. I'm still here. The fever broke, but the weakness that followed was its own kind of tyranny. Callan Hayes, a man who had not been still a day in his life, was confined to his cot, and he was a terrible patient. He hated the broth Mercy fed him. He hated the way his legs trembled when he tried to stand. And most of all, he hated the quiet, competent way she took command of his life. I can feed myself, he growled, his hand shaking as he reached for the spoon. You'll spill it, Mercy said, her voice firm, pushing the spoon to his lips.
And I just washed these blankets.
He glared at her, but he opened his mouth. The broth was rich, made from a rabbit Jonah had snared. It was the taste of life, and he was too weak to fight it. Wirt watched them from the hearth, a rare, amused glint in his eye. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted. The quiet cook, the fugitive, was now the matron, and the master of the ranch was her unwilling invalid. While Callan mended, spring arrived with a vengeance. The world, which had been silent and white, was now a roaring symphony of chaos. The snow melted in a rush, turning the yard into a thigh-deep bog of mud and slush. The creek, which had been a frozen ribbon, became a brown, churning river that threatened to flood the lower pasture. The air, once sharp and sterile, was now thick with the smell of damp earth, thawed manure, and the sharp, sweet scent of new pine growth. The ranch, their cocoon, was gone. The world was open. Mercy felt the change. The terror of the bounty hunter was gone, replaced by the deep, resonant ache of Callan's wound. But with the thaw came a restless energy. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. One afternoon, when the sun was strong and the mud had begun to dry, She took a shovel and went to the small patch of earth by the south-facing wall of the cabin. The ground was hard, but she worked at it, turning the soil, her hands digging into the cold, damp dirt. She transplanted the wild herbs she had found higher on the ridge, thyme, and a hardy, fragrant rosemary. She was planting a garden. She was putting down roots. Jonah found her there. He had been quiet since the night of the attack, watching Callan with a worried shadow in his eyes. He watched Mercy for a long time, her back bent to the task. "What's that for?" he asked. "Herbs," Mercy said, patting the soil. "For the stew, to make it taste like something other than salt." Jonah nodded. He looked at the cabin wall. "You'll need a place for 'em, to dry, and for the spices." He disappeared into the barn. For 3 days, he worked, the sound of his sawing and hammering filling the yard. Callan, who was now strong enough to sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watched him. Jonah emerged with a small, sturdy shelf, 3-tiered and perfectly level. He mounted it on the cabin wall, next to the hearth, his face set with intense concentration. Mercy came in and stopped, her hands covered in dirt. She stared at the shelf. "For the spices," Jonah said, his voice gruff, trying to mimic Callan. He would not meet her eye. Mercy walked over and ran her hand along the smooth, sanded plank. She looked at the boy, her eyes shining. "It's the finest shelf I've ever seen. Jonah." The boy flushed, his chest swelling with pride. From the porch, Callan watched them. He watched Mercy arrange her few tins on the new shelf. He watched her run her hand over the wood, and he watched the way Jonah beamed, his orphan's caution forgotten. That evening, Mercy sat with Jonah at the table. She had not forgotten his fear, or his plea. Wirt had an old almanac, its pages soft and yellowed. "This is an A," she said, her finger on the page. "It's for almanac." "AC," Jonah stumbled. "Almanac." Callan's voice rumbled from the shadows by the fire. He was cleaning his revolver, his hands still weak, but his motions precise. Jonah startled. Mercy looked up. Callan did not meet their gaze. He just kept working, his head bent. "Almanac," Jonah repeated, his voice stronger. "Good," Mercy said, her eyes on Callan's back. "Now, this is a B. It's for barley." Callan worked, pretending not to listen, but a small, quiet pride settled on his features. He was not just watching a boy learn to read. He was watching his family being built, piece by piece, from the broken parts he had left. A week later, Callan was walking, his limp pronounced but his strength returning. The wound was a puckered, angry scar, but it was healing. He and Mercy stood beneath the great cottonwood tree by the creek, the first new leaves casting a pale green shade. The world was vast and open. The road was clear. Callan looked at the rushing water, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He had not touched her since the fever. The ranch was full, with Wirt and Jonah, and the intimacy of the sick room had vanished, replaced by a new, awkward distance. "The road's clear all the way to Oregon, I reckon," he said, his voice neutral. Mercy looked at him. She knew what he was asking. The snow was gone. The bounty hunter was gone. The contract was burned. She was free. "You still planning to leave?" he asked. The words forced, his gaze fixed on the mountains. Mercy watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the scar through his eyebrow, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She thought of the herb garden. She thought of the shelf. She thought of the way he had looked at her when he woke from the fever. "Well," she said, her voice soft, "you did beg me to stay. I might be a fool if I don't listen." He turned his head. He looked at her. A long, slow breath eased out of him, a tension he had been holding for days. He did not smile, but the coldness left his eyes. He just nodded. Once. "Good," he said. They rode into Cheyenne 2 weeks later. The wagon rattled in the dried ruts, loaded with the few pelts Wirt had trapped over the winter. Mercy sat on the bench beside Callan. She was terrified. This was the world that had judged her, the town where Callan had fought for her. She wore her mended dress, but she had washed her hair, and it was pinned up neatly. She kept her head high, though her hands were clenched in her lap. As they neared the main street, Callan's large, scarred hand moved across the seat. It covered hers. He did not look at her. He just held her hand, his thumb resting on her knuckles. It was not a gesture of passion. It was a statement. She is with me. They walked into the general store. The place went silent. Men at the counter stopped talking. Mrs. Gable, who was inspecting a bolt of cloth, turned, saw them, and her face pinched. She saw their joined hands. She looked away, her lips a thin, white line. Mercy felt the stares. She heard the whispers.
That's her, the one from Colorado. Hayes is a fool. Taken up with that.
Callan ignored them. His voice boomed in the quiet room.
Mr. Phelps, I need a new skillet. The heavy one.
He was making a declaration. He was not hiding her. He was buying supplies for his cook, his woman. The whispers quieted. The blacksmith, who was buying nails, nodded. Hayes, ma'am. It was a greeting of respect. A few of the other ranchers followed suit. Callan had faced down the law, and he had won. In their eyes, that made Mercy his. Callan paid for the skillet, a heavy, black cast-iron pan. As he did, Mercy's eyes fell on a stack of shirts. They were flannel, thick and warm. Callan's own shirt was worn thin. The one he'd been shot in was beyond mending. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear.
And this one? The blue one.
She pulled the few coins she had saved from her pocket and placed them on the counter. Callan stared at her, his face flushing.
Mercy, I know, she said, not looking at him. This one is from me.
Phelps, the storekeep, looked between them, a slow smile spreading on his face. He bagged the shirt. They walked out, their heads high. Callan carried the skillet. Mercy carried the shirt. They were both embarrassed. And their hands, free now, brushed as they walked. That night, the ranch was quiet. Wirt had moved his bedroll to a small room off the stable, claiming the cabin was too crowded now that spring was here. Jonah was asleep on his cot, the almanac clutched in his hand. The fire burned low, bathing the cabin in a warm, red glow. Mercy stood by the hearth, her back to the room, her hand resting on the new shelf. She heard Callan move. He came to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she felt his heat, his presence. "It was a good shirt," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It was a good skillet," she replied, her voice soft. He turned her, his hands on her shoulders. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the firelight. The awkwardness of the town, the memory of the fever, it all melted away. "I missed you," he said. It was a stark, simple admission.
"I was right here," she whispered.
"No," he said. "I missed this." He kissed her, and this time, there was no desperation. There was no fear, no anger, no frantic claiming. It was slow, it was tender, it was familiar. It was the kiss of a man who was home. He touched her as if she were precious, his calloused hands relearning the lines of her face, her neck, her waist, and she touched him, her fingers tracing the healed scar on his side, the old puckered marks on his back. They were not ghosts. They were just part of him. They made love on the bearskin rug. Slowly, in the warm glow of the embers, it was a quiet, profound confirmation. It was not the desperate collision of two broken people. It was the settled, sure, and burning heat of two people who had chosen. It was trust. A week later, Mercy sat at the table. Callan had bought her paper and an ink pot in town. She was writing, her hand moving steadily across the page, her old, neat script telling a story. To the matron of the St. Louis Foundling Home. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that she had found work and a home in the Wyoming Territory. She wrote that she was safe. And at the end, she folded a single $10 bill into the paper. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever had at one time. "It is for the girls," she wrote, "the ones who are still waiting at the gate." She signed it, Mercy Beckett. Callan watched her seal the envelope. He would post it when Wirt rode for supplies. She was closing the door on her own past, not by running, but by reaching back to help. A year passed. The ranch held. The scar on Callan's side faded to a pale, silver line. Jonah grew an inch, and his voice, when he read aloud from a dime novel Mercy had bought him, was clear and confident. Wirt still grumbled, but he grumbled less. The herd survived the winter, and Callan's name was solid at the cattle auctions. One evening in late autumn, a new storm blew in, a wild, cold wind that promised an early snow. The sky was a bruised, turbulent purple. The three of them stood on the porch, watching it. Jonah, wrapped in a blanket, sat on the steps. Mercy leaned against the post, her arms crossed, her hair blowing free in the wind. Callan stood behind her. The wind howled, a high, lonely sound. A year ago, it would have been the sound of terror. Now, it was just the weather. Callan stepped forward, wrapping his arm around Mercy's waist. He pulled her back against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. He was a solid, warm wall against the cold. They stood like that for a long time, the three of them, watching the world rage, safe on their small island. Callan leaned his head down, his chin resting on her hair. His voice was a low rumble, meant only for her, but loud enough to be heard over the wind. "Don't matter if there's better cooks out there," he said. "I got mine." Mercy smiled, a slow, sure smile that reached her eyes. She covered his arm with her hand, her fingers lacing with his, holding him there. The wind could scream. It could not touch them. And this time, she stays. Thank you for listening to our story. We hope it brought a little of the high lonesome country into your day. We'd love to hear from you. Please, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed the story, we hope you'll subscribe to From Wild West for more tales like this one. And please, share your thoughts in English. We read every one.